We can't, in my view, separate the liberal values of toleration and integration and intergroup harmony and common national identity, that we're all Americans and we're not in some sort of war of all against Hobbesian war of all against all, from the general liberal value of free speech.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm following up on a tip from a listener who suggested that I should speak with David Bernstein. David was on Michael Shermer's podcast discussing civil liberties, free speech, and constitutional law issues from a libertarian perspective. In the current situation of highly polarized public debate, it's critical that we listen to both sides of the argument and don't fall victim to innate bias and echo chambers. This is a job for The Rational View. Please come along with me on this journey of discovery. I hope you like it. David E. Bernstein holds a university professor chair at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, including most recently, Classified, the Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. Professor Bernstein, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you.
So you were actually recommended to me by one of my listeners, thanks Joel, who heard your interview with friend of the podcast, Michael Shermer. I love to talk to Michael. He kind of holds a position of authority amongst the rational crowd as the founder of Skeptic Magazine. How did you get involved with Michael Shermer?
Well, actually, I've read my Skeptic Magazine for years, but I think Michael just contacted me because somehow he had found out about the book. And certainly, I know Skeptic Magazine has been talking about issues regarding race and biology and genetics and sociology for many years. So I assume that's what piqued Michael's interest.
Mm-hmm. You are somewhat of a prolific writer. I was looking over your bibliography. Many years ago, you were co-author on Phantom Risk, Scientific Inference and Law, where you investigate the relationship between legal and scientific evidence. I find that a very interesting topic for discussion for several reasons. You know, legal discussions, legal rulings don't follow the same evidentiary rules as science necessarily. What's your opinion from that was a while ago? I know it's not fresh in your mind, but what was your thesis in that story?
Sure. So the impetus for the book was that in the 1980s, way back when, courts were starting to deal with a lot of claims, often very, very high value claims involving millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars, claiming that exposure to various toxic substances had caused injuries. And at the time, the rules for expert testimony were extremely liberal. And basically, if you were qualified, which meant you had a degree in something related to the subject, you're allowed to testify. And of course, as in most areas, there's always going to be a bell curve of opinion. And the problem in law is that, the experts aren't chosen neutrally, they're chosen by the parties. So the plaintiffs are not going to be picking experts who are giving them the most objective, scientifically sound view based on mainstream science as to what happened. They're going to be choosing people on the outer edge of the bell curve who are, what you might call the fringe of the scientific community. And the other side, of course, are going to pick equally strong people, but the problem is that you're then going before lay jurors. And, basically our legal system is premised on the idea that you have an adversarial system. You put both sides in front of the jury and they're going to decide. And that may work okay with standard issues of credibility, who's lying, who's telling the truth, and so forth. Not even clear that's true, but certainly it's not true when it comes to scientific disputes before lay jurors who have absolutely no background in the area have to listen. They just listen to oral testimony. They can't even look at the doc. No scientist is going to listen to oral testimony and make a decision, much less a layperson. So the idea was that we should have some underlying scientific reliability standards before we let this stuff in. And the good news is that since we wrote that book, which came out, I think, in 93, the Supreme Court and later the drafters of the Federal Rules of Evidence have, in fact, made much stricter rules for admissibility of expert testimony. The bad news is that judges often don't follow the rules.
That's unfortunate, but it's also unfortunate that the issue is out there. I know, a lot of fringe scientists make a lot of good money testifying at courts and making glyphosate rulings and stuff like that. So just looking again through some of your books, in your book called "You Can't Say That," you discuss society's misguided attempt to eradicate every vestige of discrimination in society. Activists and courts are using anti-discrimination laws to erode civil liberties such as free speech, the free exercise of religion, and freedom of association. Can you elaborate a little bit on what's going on here? Like, obviously, there's a big there's a big issue about cancel culture and the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk to let freedom of speech reign. Where did you end up on this issue?
So, the irony, the book actually got a fair amount of attention, but it was published in 2003, which was after the great wave of political correctness of the late 80s and early 90s had crested, but before the great wokeification of 2014 and beyond. So at the time, a lot of people say, why are you even worried about that? The whole political correctness thing is pretty much dead. Free speech won. And I said, don't be so sure, especially because the younger generation is being basically trained by academics to say that speech is bad. Free speech is bad, and we need to regulate it, especially on behalf of minority groups. So where I basically come down is that I'm not so much an advocate of freedom of speech as such, the way some activists might say, oh, we should always allow everyone to speak, and you shouldn't ever, even private parties shouldn't censor them. I'm really taking the position that the government should be a neutral party in this regard and shouldn't be cracking down on speech that's deemed to be offensive or whatnot. And the basic reason for that is that while some of the rationales of freedom of speech, like self-expression, are nice, the real underlying reason is that once the government puts its thumb on the scale that certain speech is good and certain speech is bad, first of all, the government's undoubtedly going to be self-serving, right? And first they're going to do is crack down on critics of whatever the government's doing. And second, I point out, whatever your views on particular speech is in a country with as diverse and big, with so many different state governments and local governments, there's always going to be someone somewhere who's cracking down on speech you like. So I always tell people to imagine, their least favorite politician in the world is the one who's in charge of it, because somewhere that will be true. And the third thing is that, basically, we don't want people to be spending their time lobbying the government to be suppressing other people's speech. It's a huge waste of it's a huge waste of resources. I guess the final and related thing, which I didn't really develop in that book, but I've been developing more recently, is that we can't, in my view, separate the liberal values of toleration and integration and intergroup harmony and common national identity, that we're all Americans and we're not in some sort of war of all against Hobbesian war of all against all, from the general liberal value of free speech. People, including members of minority religious groups, ethnic groups, sexual minorities, people thrive in liberal societies. When you start cracking down on speech, for whatever reason, you are inviting illiberalism, and that will be bad all around.
Yeah, I agree. Free speech is an important right to protect if we want to have a fully functioning democracy. But isn't there a line to be drawn on personal freedoms where it starts to cause harm to others? And then the question is, what is wrong with our society, what we've been doing, and where should we be drawing the lines between freedom and harm?
Well, I think that, I've actually been writing about I'm writing an article right now about the campus demonstrations, They would say they're pro-Palestinian. I would say they're effectively pro-Hamas, but we could agree to disagree about that. But in any event, here's a good example. A lot of people on the anti-Hamas or pro-Israel side have been calling for a crackdown on the speech of the protesters. And in my view, where the protesters have gone too far, and where you could get rid of 98% of the problem is just by applying neutral rules that have never been considered part of free speech. Free speech doesn't include the right to vandalize, doesn't include the right to take over buildings, doesn't include the right to put encampments on public or private property against the permission of whoever's in charge of the property, doesn't include intimidation, doesn't include harassment. You get rid of, and when I say intimidation, harassment, I don't mean just vague, I don't like you, but, actual personally directed stuff. And if the universities would have been in the last year and a half neutrally enforcing their general rules, prohibiting all this stuff, then almost all the problem goes away. You then just have a debate, maybe a impolitic debate, maybe a nasty debate, but you have a normal free speech debate. And the real problem is the failure to enforce the rules neutrally.
I mean, that does also sound like it's pushing back on the right to protest. And certainly when issues become polarized and feelings get up, the amount of protest and civil disobedience can increase. At some point there are unjust rules of law that require some level of civil disobedience, don't you think?
Well, the underlying premise always of civil disobedience was that you violate the law and accept the consequences. And the very fact that you're willing to accept the consequences shows how important this is and how deep it is. And if enough people do that, it becomes disruptive to the system. What we have instead are people who insist on disobeying the rules, but then insist that they should never be punished for it. That's not really what we've traditionally meant by civil disobedience. That's breaking the rules with no consequence. And everyone has their issues, right? And if we let everyone do that, I mean, we could, a lot of the rationales that people have given for why we shouldn't punish these individuals, you could use equally forthrightly in favor of the January 6th rioters who came into the Capitol. Say, well, they were engaged in civil disobedience. They thought the election was fixed. Well, depends whose ox is gored here. Again, they had every right to come to Washington and protest. But once you, of course, start going into the Capitol illegally, start assaulting police officers, start vandalizing things, then you've crossed the line. And if you say, well, civil disobedience, okay, well, the civil disobedience means that you then accept the punishment of the law.
Yeah, there does seem to be a line of, I would say, variable enforcement of civil disobedience. There's not a standard, we're going to crack down on all civil disobedience. As you say, we're not enforcing the law. We allow protests to go on in places where, blocking traffic, and they're not supposed to be doing this. And the police are often afraid to step in. But you make a good point that, if you are involved in civil disobedience, then you expect to take the punishment for that civil disobedience. And that is part of your stand. So, you're not preventing civil disobedience. You're just saying, let's neutrally enforce the laws. Okay. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And it's not really being done. I wonder why.
Well, look, everyone has the causes that they themselves sympathize with. They feel, I don't want to punish someone for this. And, it's understandable, but part of liberalism writ large, part of having a liberal society is that we can't have the authorities playing favorites because it builds on itself. I am not in any way excusing either Trump's pardons of the January 6th rioters, nor their actions. But it's when people then ask on the pro-Trump side, well, what about all the people who engaged in illegal activities? Again, they were mostly peaceful, mostly non-violent protests in summer 2020, but there was a fair amount of violence and property destruction, and there was very little prosecution of those people. And well, what about that? Because you agree with Black Lives Matter, if you're not going to punish them, it becomes a precedent. The other side says, well, we'll push the envelope a little further. And the next time there's, and you get the idea, that the police universities, especially state universities, FBI, federal authorities, state authorities have to have a neutral posture toward it, because there's no such thing ultimately as actions with no consequences. If you get into people's minds that, well, people on the left could violate the law, they're not going to get prosecuted, then people on the right are going to expect to be able to do the same, and they'll push things a little further. Then people on the left will do this, eventually we're going to end up in civil war. And some people want that, but those are not the kind of people we want to be encouraging.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head when you say that we've been pushing the boundaries of approved behavior in government, especially. And your book, was it called Lawless? The Obama administration's unprecedented assault on the Constitution and the rule of law. You claim that Obama ignored the Constitution whenever he didn't get congressional support. Is that an example of what you're talking about here?
I really think it is, because, when I wrote the book, people on the left largely ignored it, and they said, which I expected, but they were the wrong audience, and the audience was really conservatives and Republicans, in the sense that first of all, I knew that, look, Obama had his good sides and bad sides like any president, but there was this aura about him where people really had a devotion to him. They thought, I'm sure you were around in 2008 when it was almost like a messianic event for some people, and he became president. I remember this ridiculous video where all these famous Hollywood personalities were talking about how they're inspired by Obama to do, socially conscious things. I remember one movie, I don't remember who it was, but one actress said, I'm only going to flush when I do number 2. That was her contribution. The whole thing was almost a parody, but it wasn't. But so I understood. So Obama pushed the envelope in a lot of ways, while not expressing contempt for the law. A lot of things were done in ways when Congress wouldn't go along. I mean, he said at one of his State of the Union addresses, I have my pen, I have my phone, so I'm going to go around the normal legislative process and do what I can do. And I thought that this was a danger, and my book was sort of aimed at Republicans. If they won the next election, hey, this is a good time to restore proper limits on executive authority.
Of course, instead they went further.
Right. Of course, as I'm writing the book, Donald Trump, and in fact, the book to get that much attention because Trump sucked up all the air. The book came out in 2015, but Donald Trump is like I want maybe nightmare would be going too far, but he is exactly the counter reaction one would fear, that if the Democrats are going to abuse the process and put a lot of authority into the executive branch, we're going to do it in spades. And in fact, Trump was somewhat restrained in 2016 in his first presidency. First of all, because he was completely unprepared to be president. No one including him thought he was going to win. He didn't have a plan in place. He didn't have people in place. By the time they really got their act together, his term was over. That's one issue. Another issue was that he had a lot of very mainstream people around him who were not interested really in pushing the envelope. Now we're seeing, when he's reelected, he did have a plan in place. He does have his people there, and he is really pushing the envelope on executive authority. But the people who are now the American Bar Association, the deans of law schools, law professors, all saying, "Oh my God, so much we're concentrating all this authority of the president. The president doesn't have authority to do all these things unilaterally." Well, where were you in 2012, 2015? Where were you? The Biden administration pushed the envelope also on a lot of stuff for purely political reasons. For example, most infamously, basically trying to forgive a couple $1 trillion worth of loans. We're talking now about Trump using the Treasury as his personal piggyback bank, deciding what to spend and what not to spend, refusing to collect, hundreds of billions of dollars of loans based on extremely vague statutory language about emergencies and so forth. And the Supreme Court said you can't do it. Biden did as much of it as he could. But these kind of things, again, they build on each other. I think one thing I've learned to appreciate after being a law professor for 30 years is there's the formal law that we rely on, but there's also underlying norms. And the formal law really depends a lot on people being willing to follow the underlying norms. And norms are much easier. They're there until they're not. Everyone takes them for granted, and then suddenly, when they're violated, they just go away very quickly, and then we wind up in a real problem.
Yeah, I interviewed Stephen Levitsky on his book, How Democracies Die. And, one of the points that he made was that for democracy to function, each side must have the willingness to allow the other side to govern when they win. And that is missing. That's been missing since Obama, right? When Obama got in office, the Republicans just stopped passing legislation. They basically, they wouldn't allow him to put a Supreme Court justice on. They basically just said, no, we're going to take our toys and leave. And, since then it's just been downhill, because then, okay, so I've got the will of the people, but I can't do anything. So what do we do?
The way you express that actually reflects a real problem. It's not your fault. This is a more general problem, which is that our constitutional structure doesn't match the structure of our politics. By which I mean our constitutional structure is that Congress is really supposed to be the primary governing body. And the president, well, he's in charge of military. He gives, general directions of where the country is going, but Congress really passes the legislation. But in practice, the public expects the president to be in charge. And the president wants to be in charge. And when the president has a Congress of another party, even when his own party's in power, but they don't have enough votes in the Senate, or there's some stragglers in the House that won't go along with them, the president is sorely tempted to do things unilaterally. And let me just express, this is a real problem. In that sense, we don't want the president to just be governing, because, when I grew up, I don't know how old you are, I'm 57. So one thing that I read about when I was, in college and so forth, which I really appreciated, was that in the U.S., most people didn't care about politics, especially compared to foreign countries. And one reason we didn't care about politics was because our elections were not that important. And by which I mean that to get anything radical done in the United States, anything significant, you really need to win the kind of election that FDR won in 32 or 36, or Lyndon Johnson won in 64, where you have overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress. Our system was designed to make it difficult. It was conservative in the small C sense, difficult to get anything done, because you have to get through both houses of Congress, you have to get through all the committees and so forth, and then you have to get the president to sign it. So that meant in practice, when Congress was still the primary governing body of this country, to get any legislation passed, you had to get the median member of the House, the median member of the Senate, and the president all on board, which is inherently going to moderate whatever you do. Now, really, since in the last 20 years, you could trace it to Bush, you could trace it to Obama. It's not really clear where the dividing line is, but somehow it's become the norm that when a president comes in, the executive branch issues a whole series of executive orders, basically reversing the other guy's policies. So environmental policy shifts 180 degrees, labor policy 180 degrees, civil rights 180, without Congress doing anything. And look, Trump won the election by 1%, right? So if this was all down to, and Congress is very closely split, if this goes down to Congress, you wouldn't be able to do anything radical. But you just do it through executive order, and all of a sudden elections become intensely important. And that makes Americans much more interested in elections and much more likely to hate the other side, because they really feel like everything will change if the other guy wins. And I think that's been really bad for America.
Mm-hmm. So what's to be done?
Good question. If you had asked me this 10 years ago, I've said we need, I'd like to use George Washington as the model. George Washington was the first elected leader or any leader of a country since the Roman era, since Caesar took over, to actually give up power voluntarily after a democratic election. Or maybe there's some obscure tribe somewhere, but anyone that I know about anyway. And he had his 2 terms and he went home. So someone who exercises that sort of self-restraint and says, yes, I could exercise this power, but I won't. But of course, that's not going to be Donald Trump. So that's not, so I can't give you that as my solution right now, although it'd be nice to have someone like that. But I think one solution would be for somehow some leaders in the Senate and House to arise who wanted to get their own power and didn't like the president arroging it so much to himself. But I think the other possible solution is the Supreme Court has been making a lot of noises about reining in the ability of the executive branch to just make policy however they want without pretty direct congressional influence. Ironically, maybe progressives have been really, really opposed to this move because for historical reasons, this was a New Deal kind of thing, right? For generations, the model for progressives was you bring in someone like Franklin Roosevelt who wants to help, in their view, the people, and he does things very quickly and dramatically to help, and they thought that was the way to go. And that the administrative state, I guess, is mostly on the progressive side, staffed by, highly educated East Coast elites, really educational elites at least. So they like the bureaucracy and the presidency to have a lot of independence and authority, but not just me. Some of my libertarianish friends out there have been warning them, for years. What happens when someone like Donald Trump seizes the reins of power? Don't you want the executive branch to be somewhat restrained? Don't you want the Supreme Court to say, you know what, if this isn't clearly in some statute somewhere, you can't do it? And they say, oh, we're not really, whatever. They were poo-pooing the.
That'll never happen.
That'll never happen. A lot of things that all the things that people say will never happen, happen. In fact, a good example is the consumer finance. It's a CFPB. I'm trying to remember exactly what it stands for. It's Elizabeth Warren's new regulatory agency, and
Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
Yeah, there you go. So, in order to prevent the Republicans from messing with its funding, she provided in her legislation for them to have their own funding mechanism. Basically, Congress doesn't have to give them a cent. There are obvious constitutional issues with that, which the court has been considering over time. But what happened now? Trump comes in and says, well, actually, you know what? The enabling legislation for this act says that CFPB has to decide how much money it needs and then raise it on its own, basically through regulations. And we decide they don't need anything. So it turns out we could just defund the CFPB without any new legislation. So here's a mechanism that progressives thought they were going to use to insulate themselves from congressional oversight, and instead it let another executive, they did this in the Obama years when progressives were, sure that they were going to be in power forever, basically. And it turns out that, I think you have to recognize ultimately that that the country's 50-50. When things seem to be shifting one way, the other party is going to change to make it 50-50 again. And we could assume over any given 50-year period, probably going to be about half Republicans in power in the Congress and in the presidency, and half Democrats. And if whatever your nightmare is about who you think would be in power, you have to make rules that would restrain them and not assume that it's going to be, if you're a Democrat, it's going to be Barack Obama in power forever.
Right. I mean, so you're basically just arguing for fairness and following the rules and not making fancy tricks to get around them, because you feel you're right. Because both sides feel they're right and deserve these special treatments.
Yeah, if you talk to people on the left about this, and similarly on the right, they say, "But the other side will do this." Oh, no, they won't. Well, why not? Well, because they're wrong, and we're right. So of course, yes, but right. Even if they're right about being right, there's no rule that right wins in politics. Power wins in politics. Whoever gets the most votes wins in politics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, going again through your bibliography, you wrote A Conspiracy Against Obamacare, the Volokh Conspiracy, and the Healthcare Case. You discuss how you and a few other bloggers developed constitutional arguments against Obama's Affordable Care Act. Why do you oppose universal health care?
Well, really, I do. Government imposed universal health care anyway, but that's just because I oppose everything, really. I basically have libertarian views on politics, so it's not healthcare to begin with. But really, going to the book itself, this was really about the legal arguments, because the legal arguments are, I believe, separate from the merits of whether Obamacare was good. And of course, Obamacare is not quite universal health care. It was criticized from the left as well as the right. But the question, look, just to give a very basic review of the issues. So the Constitution says that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce among the states, more specifically. There's also a clause that says that all Congress's power should be interpreted in light of what's necessary and proper for the government to do. And from the 1930s through the 1990s, the position of the Supreme Court following the Roosevelt administration, the growth of government, was this puts no substantive limits on the government's ability to regulate beyond what's in the Bill of Rights. And in other words, regulate commerce among the states, what's necessary and proper. Everything is necessary and proper because we're all interconnected, we're all interrelated, Gaia and all this. Everything's connected, so there's no limits on the government's authority. So when we get to the Affordable Health Care Act, there are a whole variety of ways that Congress could have expanded access to health care that would not have raised constitutional issues given existing precedent. The way Congress chose to do it was to put a tax on Americans who didn't purchase healthcare themselves or have healthcare through their employer. This may, in fact, be an economically sound, we don't want free riders and so forth. And in fact, it was Republicans and conservatives who initially came up with, well, if you're going to have some sort of universal health care, the way to do it is to get rid of the free rider problem, the young, healthy people who don't pay. So it's not that it's so horrible on a policy perspective once you're doing it. There are other aspects of Obamacare I object more to than that. But the problem was this was novel. The Supreme Court had made noises since the 90s about limiting Congress's power. And a lot of people, including me, say, well, look, what the Supreme Court has basically been doing since the 1990s is saying, look, we can't really go back to the 1930s and the scope of federal power there. But if Congress tries to exercise any novel powers, we're not going to let them go any further. We're not going to give Congress what we call a general police power to do everything they want. States have a general police power. There's no question states could constitutionally have something like Obamacare. The question is, can you require individuals to purchase a product? And people try to come up with, a lot of law professors, historians tried to find an example in American history where Congress had used its commerce power to force people to buy something. They couldn't find anything. So my position in blogging was, look, in a conservative Supreme Court that doesn't really like these New Deal decisions to begin with, they're not going to let Congress take that additional step to do something it's never been permitted to do before. And people poo-pooed it. People in the legal academy said it's completely absurd. Everyone knows this isn't a real limit. It turns out that Congress actually agreed with those of us who made this argument 5-4. And the reason Obamacare was upheld was that Chief Justice Roberts used an obscure argument that this was real, that this was in fact, even though Congress said it wasn't a tax, it was just a penalty, that was really a tax, and it's upheld under a separate power of Congress known as the taxing power. So it really, this was less a policy argument than kind of a law nerd argument, although it did, of course, have policy implications. And the ultimate argument was, does Congress have basically virtually unlimited regulatory power over the economy, or are there some meaningful limits?
I see. Yeah, and it certainly is a different situation in the U.S. than up here in Canada in terms of how the powers that are allowed the federal government over the states. You're more United States that have come together as individual entities, whereas Canada is kind of more top down.
Oh yeah, it's funny. I didn't even realize I'm wearing the maple. I don't know if you noticed. I'm actually wearing a maple leaf shirt from Ruth.
Awesome.
I didn't even realize you were in Canada. So I feel like I've now. I know there's been some Canadian American tensions lately, so now we can have some amity here. But yeah, I was actually just reading about this. I have to admit being fairly ignorant about Canada's version of federalism, but I was actually kind of surprised to recently learn that Canada actually, that the provinces actually in a lot of ways have more power than the American states, which is ironic because the reason we're called the United States was that our states were originally considered to be truly autonomous entities, like a state, like,
Yeah, in practice, I don't see a lot of difference, but it seems to be like there are, things written down that you can interpret one way or the other. And I'm not an expert on any of that by any stretch, but thank you for wearing the maple leaf, in honor of Canada's hockey victory over the U.S. Thank you so much.
I have to say, it's funny because I remember 30 years ago, I was in Australia just after New Zealand, just after New Zealand beat the U.S. in America's Cup. And I was hanging out with a law professor in New Zealand who was trying to tease me about this. And I'm like, this America's Cup thing that's a yacht race for those who aren't familiar. It can be a big deal in New Zealand, but not 1 in 100 Americans, including me, care about this.
Sure.
And hockey isn't quite at that level, but I think Canadians are a lot more excited about the hockey victory than Americans.
Yes, it was an existential crisis for most of us. So your most recent book, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification. What's not been told? Let's talk about your new book.
So, I actually I haven't done much in the way of comparative work on this book for basically time constraint reasons. I thought like, okay, and space. I thought I have a whole book here. So I don't actually know, for example, what Canada has been doing about this, although I should. But in the United States, we are constantly faced with boxes that we have to check, describing what our race or ethnicity is, and just for listeners both in Canada or viewers both in Canada and the U.S., our boxes are, first they're asked if you're Hispanic or not. This has now just been changed, but hasn't gone through the system yet. But when I wrote the book, first, are you Hispanic or not, which means you have any Spanish-speaking origins, and then you're asked if you're a member of one of these 5 racial groups: white, African American / Black, Native American / American Indian, Asian American, or Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian. Those are your 5. And we have this has become just sort of part of the background noise of American life. And we just sort of accept, we check these boxes. If a public opinion poll person would call you, they would ask you which of these groups you belong to. When we do scientific research, social science research, and when we admit students to colleges, anything, when we apply for jobs, all the stuff now involves checking these boxes. And we've just come to sort of accept this as natural and normal. But my question going into this book was, well, how did we come up with this system? For example, Asian American, according to the official and there are official definitions, which, I think one thing people don't know that I didn't know is how do we come up with this? Well, our federal government, our national government, had some committee in the 1970s said, hey, we're getting a lot of immigrants. We don't really know how to classify them. Different agencies are classifying them in different ways for different laws that require classification. Let's come up with something uniform. And they did it in a really haphazard way. But so, for example, Asian American includes people anywhere from the western border who ancestors came anywhere from the western border of Pakistan all the way to the Philippines. What does a Filipino and a Pakistani have in common? Well, they say, well, from Asia. But then Arabs are also from Asia, and we don't put them there, and they have historically been considered white in the form. Or why is Hispanic there at all? Why is Spanish-speaking ancestry one ethnicity to begin with? If you told Mexicans and Argentines and they're the same group, they would get very offended. And why don't we include groups that were traditionally considered ethnic minorities in the United States, like Italian Americans or Irish Americans? So the book goes through the history of how these classifications evolved, how they came to be used ubiquitously, and then some implicit criticisms and some more explicit criticisms of them, and then some thoughts about what one might do in the future.
Yeah, you wonder why race is the most important classifier. I mean, I guess historically it's been a huge impact, but what about religion? Check the box if you're Christian, Muslim, or atheist.
So one of the more interesting things I learned from this book is that the United States did not traditionally have national classifications except for our census. There was no government agency keeping track of anybody. The census would ask initially, are you black or white? And then over time they added different Asian categories that shifted every 10 years, depending on, they couldn't really figure out what to do with, Indian Americans and from India and other South Asians or Filipinos. Are they Hispanic? Are they Pacific Islanders? Are they Asian? But it changed. And then Hispanics were generally considered to be white unless they were clearly not white. But when they in the 1950s, our federal government started trying to enforce equal opportunity rules against federal contractors. And they would send a form out to the federal contractors and say, are you complying with our equal opportunity guidelines? They'd say yes. Well, that's very nice, but what if they're lying? They say, okay, from now on, we want them to tell us how many people they have of each group. And, if there's some place it's only white men, we could then investigate further. But who should we ask them about? And early versions either, sometimes added Jews or Catholics or Italian Americans, or sometimes just said, tell us about others, whatever you think. And anyway, what it came down to is that, first of all, African American civil rights groups said race is the key thing. We think race is the big dividing line in American life, and we should focus on that. So that was the ideological reason. The practical reason was that it was considered at the time at best rude and at worst illegal and discriminatory to ask people, what is your background? So if you're filling out this form, this was before the HR industry got big, but if you're whatever the equivalent of an HR official was at a defense contractor in the 1950s, and you're asked, how many minority employees do you have? Well, you can't ask people, raise your hand if you're a minority and tell us what minority you are. That was unacceptable until the 1970s. So instead, you look around the room and you say, okay, 2 people look black, 1 person looks, like he might be Mexican.
So easy to pick out.
Easy to pick out. And also, so race became the dividing line, again, partly for ideological reasons, but partly because if you're not going to ask people to self-identify, the only way to know really is to or like at least try to know is visually.
Mm-hmm. And so, what are they doing with it? So I understand, it's good to have data on these things, to have a metric to make sure that you're not biased. But obviously more is being done with this. So what have you discovered in terms of the usage of this racial classification stuff?
Well, like they are used to enforce civil rights laws, although, in sort of odd ways, because you could be in a town that is 50% Asian American, split among, let's say, divided in 3 between Vietnamese, Chinese, and Indian Americans. And you could be an Indian, let's say, not to pick on Indian Americans, but you could be an Indian American employer. Decide you're only going to hire Indian Americans. But the government would never know when you fill out the forms because it just says Asian.
There's no checkbox for that.
It just says Asian, so there's no distinction. Or for that matter, and we use these things for our affirmative action policies in the United States for admitting students, which are now officially illegal, but still are being done to try to have a quote unquote diverse student body. But again, we get into these definitional problems as the U.S. has gotten more diverse. Over 20% of Black Americans are either first or second generation immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean, and they dominate the population of African American students at places like Harvard or MIT. So, but they weren't really the ones that these policies were initially meant for. I mean, our affirmative action policies were initially meant to bring African Americans who had been descendants of slaves who had suffered through Jim Crow and violence and segregation and were isolated from the American mainstream into that mainstream. And instead, over time, even among the Black population, the beneficiaries have become disproportionately people whose ancestors didn't suffer that. I always say, like, actually, people like Barack Obama would be a good example. Mother was white, father was from Kenya. Father was more likely to have, father's family was not slaves, but they may have been slave traders or slave owners, themselves. So that's kind of weird. But I'd say this, and for the people who like to read Skeptic, this might be the most interesting thing, but also is the most egregious to me. The shocking thing to me was that they've come to be used routinely in biomedical research. Congress in the 1990s did something which I think was probably scientifically justified. They said, biomedical companies only like to do studies on men because men are more hormonally and biologically stable than women are. And they're not, in the sense that, doesn't matter what time of month it is. It doesn't, you don't go through menopause. You don't get pregnant. You don't have to worry about someone getting pregnant and causing a birth defect if you do some sort of medical test, right? So for cost reasons, to avoid all those complications, they prefer men. And Congress, but the problem is that because women are biologically different, if you're not testing things on women, you might be missing important stuff. So women's groups lobbied to have Congress require that things be tested on women as well as men. Fine. At first, the civil rights groups said, "Oh, we don't want race to go in that. Race is not biological. It's there's no discernible. As you know, I'm sure the DNA differences between humans are very, very minor. So generally, no reason to suspect things will be different. But at some point, that they switched and said, "Well, we want our people to be represented too." Members of racial minority groups, especially African Americans, are less likely to participate in these studies. They're skeptical of the medical establishment. They're worried that that they won't be treated well. So you have to go out of your way to admit to make sure that race is being considered also, without any real scientific basis for it. Congress didn't say how to do this. Congress told our regulatory agencies, our Food and Drug Administration, which regulates pharmaceutical companies, biomedical companies, and our NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is the primary giver of federal grants for research, you have to now make sure you have enough members of each group. They didn't say what enough meant. They didn't say what groups you had to do. But here's the issue. When these regulations were being implemented, FDA and NIH had to decide what to tell their regulated bodies. What they should have done in an ideal world, or even in a rational world, is they should have brought together a group of, an expert group of geneticists, sociologists, anthropologists, and so forth.
Right.
People with expertise to say, under what circumstances should we be looking at race? It might make more sense, for example, to pick out my group, Ashkenazi Jews, for certain kinds of studies because we're very inbred groups. So we have a lot of, or Icelanders or Hungarians, or certain groups that are, it may make more sense than, like, say, Hispanics. But of course, if you are running one of these agencies, the last thing in the world you want to do is call an expert panel to decide what race is, what ethnicity is, and when should it be used. You are just asking for trouble. So what did they do? They just went back to these box checking things that we made up in the 1970s, which, by the way, specifically when the law that implemented them, these are not scientific or anthropological categories. They made them into scientific categories. So we have this absurd and truly insane thing where to get a study approved by FDA or NIH, you have to show you have enough Hispanics, enough Asians, whatever that means. And it's complete scientific nonsense. During the early days of COVID, I was really intensely following all the studies, and someone came out with a study on Asians and COVID. And I just emailed the study author, just out of curiosity, when you say Asians, who'd you study this? Who? They're all Chinese. Okay, well, that might be useful information to have. But how would this, if you're a doctor and there's a study on Asians and you don't know which group it is, someone who's Indian or Filipino who's not really genetically closely related to Chinese walk in, what information does that give you? It doesn't give you anything useful. If you do a test on Hispanics, you could have done it in Miami, where the Cuban American population is largely of European origin, or you could have done it in a neighborhood in New York where they're mostly Dominicans who have substantial African origin. But all it'll show is that you did it on Hispanics. It's complete, utter nonsense. It's unscientific, and it's actually crowded out what we should. I'm not against genetics. We should be looking for genetic factors, which may go across groups, genetic factors for disease, and not looking at race at all.
Highlight, genetic defects or genetic changes that make groups particularly susceptible. I mean, this is where you would get if you had a scientific committee to look at these things rather than just checking the boxes.
Right. So, what's the name? That disease, there's a blanket name of the disease that Africans get from mosquitoes.
Malaria.
Sorry, the disease they get because they're immune from malaria.
Sickle cell anemia.
Thank you. Sickle cell anemia. So people say, well, you say that race isn't related to disease. Well, what about sickle cell anemia? Sickle cell anemia is endemic to any group that lives in, like, equatorial regions where there's a lot of malaria. It's not actually race-based. So that's a really good example. If you're looking only at race, we have African Americans who are getting sickle cell anemia, it must be race. But scientists will tell you, no, that's not the basis of it. So of course there is some correlation between race and your genetic heritage, but it's not sufficiently close, and there's no genetic markers that are so specific to any racial group that you should be using race as a proxy. And for that matter, again, the crude way we do it in the U.S. is we include everyone from sub-Saharan Africa all the way up to Ethiopia and Somalia. And we do have substantial Somali and Ethiopian populations, some of whom are more closely related to Arab Americans or Arab populations than to sub-Saharan Africans.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a problem in terms of a scientific basis of studies that should not have gotten in there. So good job in rooting that out and highlighting that issue.
I wish scientists have, they were appalled by this when it first came out 20 years ago, but, they just, your average scientist is like, just let me do my research. I don't want to rock the boat. And they just
rolled over, did they?
Yeah, they did.
Rolled over and took it. Oh no, that's so embarrassing for those of us who like science. Wow. So, racial classification has become a huge issue right now with the DEI policies of the Trump government or the anti-DEI pogrom of the Trump government. Do you think there is a place for diversity, equity, inclusion in basically all of our governance structures and in our how we do run companies and things like that?
Well, let's separate the three letters out. Diversity is good in the sense that it's good to have different perspectives and understandings of the world. As a goal into and of itself, I think it has limited viability. But the real issue is that when people say diversity, they mean this very limited diversity based on what boxes you check. So, there are a lot of institutions in the United States that are diverse in the sense that we have some African Americans, we have some Asian Americans, we have some white Americans, and we have some Black Americans. But we all went to Harvard and we all voted for for Joe Biden twice, right? That's a strange form of diversity. And of course, again, there is diversity within these groups. So you may not actually be reflecting diversity, even if you. I sort of call it like visual diversity, that we have people who look like they're from different groups. It doesn't mean they're actually representing their populations overall, nor that they are really diverse in their worldview. Equity, I just don't like at all, in the sense that the underlying ideology of equity is that as Ibram Kendi has famously or infamously said, that anytime there's any disparity among groups, you can assume there's discrimination. And thus equity means there should never be any disparities among groups. Well, there's no society in the world that has multiple ethnic groups where the ethnic groups all have the same, distribution in different educational fields, different professions, different social mobility, whatever factors you want to look at. So yes, you want to root out discrimination, but the assumption that every group will, in the absence of discrimination, distribute itself in exactly the same way is just not viable. And in fact, what you see worldwide is that sometimes it's minority groups that, in places like Malaysia, the Chinese actually do better than the group that's in power. So it's also not always a power relationship, which is not an excuse to ignore discrimination where it exists, but it's a weird goal to have. Inclusion is a good goal. It is economically inefficient, morally deficient to have environments that are hostile so that some of your employees don't feel valued, feel they're being discriminated against, are being discriminated against, can't get promotions, and so forth. And I think that there is room. There should be there, and there are. Look, within the DEI world, there are some good people. I shouldn't say good. There are some people who are not. Everyone's well-meaning, let's just say, or almost everybody. But there are some people who are well-meaning in a way that I approve of, which is that they really want just mutual understanding, and they want people like and it's very, very easy. Like I think with mutual understanding is we require all our employees to have like neat haircuts, and when white people think of neat haircuts, they may mean something like a military haircut for men. Yeah. But if you have well-kempt dreadlocks in the African American community, this would be considered a very neat and proper haircut, and you might not understand that if you have no experience. You have a Muslim employee who wants to, and you say, oh, let's all go out to lunch with this client. And he says, "Oh, it's Ramadan. I can't eat during Ramadan." He said, "You have to, right?" They don't understand, right? That kind of inclusivity, and making people understand cultural distinctions to avoid misunderstandings. I think that's valuable. Unfortunately, for the most part, is not the way DEI has been done in the United States. DEI was brought in a very ideologically loaded basis. Let me just give you one example of the kinds of things that's going on with DEI. You go to a university, you're a freshman, a first-year student, and you go to an orientation session, and they do a privilege walk. And they say, how many of you are a member of a racial minority? How many of you are white? Take a step up. How many of you have a family income over $100,000? How many of you have two parents who are married and raised you? And how many, blah, 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 blah. And then those of you who wind up at the head of the line, you're the most privileged, and you need to understand how privileged you are and feel bad about it. That is not, that sort of thing is intentionally trying to be divisive. It's one thing to make people aware of the fact that they have some advantages, but it's another thing to say, if this thing happened in your life that's out of your control, you are inherently in some sense guilty of something.
There seems to be a real blowback in terms of the guilt factor to have people point out their privileges. Like if people's privileges are pointed at them, they have this real guilt reaction and they feel bad. But it's not their fault that they were born white. It's not their fault that they were born in a privileged location. So, I don't think in general this stuff is meant to, introduce these feelings of guilt, right? So it's useful, and it points out that you have a head start, right? It's useful that you don't have to deal with all of this other shit, that you don't have to demonstrate that you fit in a role as a white law student. There's lots of white law students, and people at the bar are mostly white, and you don't feel like an outsider. You don't have to fight this. So I think pointing out the impacts of these differences is somewhat important, isn't it?
Sure, there are ways of doing it, but let me tangle with you a little bit on whether they're intending the guilt and all that. One thing that was really, I mentioned this in the book, but it was a little off topic, so I wrote an article discussing this later. But one thing other than this medical stuff with the box checking that I found so crazy, maybe the most remarkable thing I discovered in my research for the book is that at some point when I was looking into particular academic literature, particularly from sociologists and anthropologists, about racial classification to see what they had to say, I kept coming across this phrase, white racial consciousness. And yeah, I raised my eyebrow. I see you raising your eyebrow. I raise my eyebrow also, because this is the kind of thing you expect to hear from white supremacists and so forth, right, that we want. But their view, it turns out, is that America is so innately and intrinsically racist that the only way we're going to overcome racism is for white people to recognize their white racial conscience. For us, first of all, we need to encourage white people to identify as white and not as Catholics or gamers or gay, whatever other identities they may have. Their primary identity should be white, because then once they identify as white, they will recognize their white privilege. And once they recognize their white privilege, they will use that recognition to become anti-racist activists. And it's not surprising that anthropologists and sociologists would say this, who believe in this thing, because they probably went through something like that epiphany. Sure. However, as a practical matter, we all know about human nature, and we don't know it just from intuition. We know from psychological studies that people have in-group bias. There are some people who overcome in-group bias, like maybe these professors. But generally, if you think of yourself as a white person, that's your intrinsic identity. Your motive or incentive will be to help other white people, and not to become an anti-racist activist. And in fact, I did a little, again, not the focus of my book, but I did some research on this out of curiosity. So surely there are some studies on not just on in-group bias specifically, but on white identity. And it turns out there are. And not surprisingly, if you ask Americans who are white, how strongly do you identify as a white person? That identification is directly correlated with racism. The more you think of yourself as a white person, the more you
Or racist you are.
You have a racist, you have an in-group
The more
bias.
likely you're going to be Sig Heiling.
So these folks, I think, have a very naive view of how this is going to work, and they think by encouraging people to feel guilty, to feel like they're a white person, and they'll feel guilty about it, and then they'll want to help non-white people. And I think that in the long run, and maybe even in the short to medium run, this will actually lead white people to do things like vote for candidates who are making coded or even explicit racial appeals to whites. Now, people on the left think that Donald Trump is doing that. We don't need to get into whether he's really doing that or not. But to the extent they think so, they should recognize that as partially an outgrowth of what they've, as a backlash against what they've been encouraging.
Very, very insightful. Yeah, I mean, you do see this discrepancy, and obviously the fact that there are certain advantages with being white in civilization, society as we know it, is something that we should be aware of. But if you also look at the distribution of wealth in our society, there's still quite a bit of overlap between the poor minorities and the poor whites. And if you start kneecapping all whites to try to make up for this inherited privilege, you're also kneecapping the poor people that don't benefit from it, and they're going to be angry. And I think we're seeing some of that as well.
And of course, you also have people who are white but have other disadvantages. And one thing that people will sometimes point out, which is true, is that even more than the gap in earnings between, say, Black Americans and white Americans, short Americans versus tall Americans, it's actually it's a bias that we're generally not cognizant of. It's not overtly expressed. But if you're tall and handsome, you are going to make a lot more money on average than someone who is short and portly, or just tall versus short even. Or good looking versus not.
I mean, there's companies that I've worked in that most of the executive managers are over 6 feet tall.
So there's a lot of different biases in the world, and there are people who've grown up in very hardscrabble circumstances, of course, who are of European origin, and they resent being told that they're privileged. And also, I don't like the word privilege in a sense. A lot of things that they talk about as being white privilege, like, oh, you don't have to be worried about being pulled over by the police randomly. Well, that's true as a rule, but it's not really a privilege not to be done. That's just my basic right as an American. And instead of saying that I'm privileged and that I should be losing my privilege, we should all insist that everybody have the rights of Americans to not be pulled over arbitrarily based on irrelevant characteristics.
Sure, and I mean the whole question is, how do you get there without waiting 100 years, right? And so that's the challenge, that how much unfairness is fair in righting the wrongs. And some people think two wrongs make a right, and some people don't. But then this means that the inequality extends longer than it otherwise would need to. But do you disadvantage someone who is not to blame for this to make up for that? So it's not a simple question. It's easy to be on a position and poke at the other side, but I think it's a very difficult situation to solve.
Yeah, I mean, when I give talks about this, I always say, like, the people who believe that we need to do the woke DEI kind of stuff or other things that I might object to, they're basing it on an understanding of American society and a prediction of what will happen if they don't do it. I'm also basing things on a prediction, an understanding of American society, and a prediction of what will happen. And mine is a more optimistic perspective. And my empirical basis for being optimistic, although of course the past results, as they tell you when you sign up for a mutual fund, past results do not dictate future performance, is that first of all, we've made progress. We've made a lot of progress on race, even though it's not always obvious how much we've made, but even more so, if you go back, and this is a theme, implicit theme in my book, if you go back to, let's say, 1960, we had a lot of people who are considered minorities, not racial minorities, but have been recognizably minorities, like Italian Americans or Catholics more generally. The United States was run by Protestant white men from its founding until JFK became president. We had a Catholic seat on the Supreme Court, a Jewish seat, but the very fact it was a seat tells you something, right? That you get one, and that's it. And if you would tell people hey, in 1960, hey guys, 60 years from now, we're going to have a Catholic president Catholic Speaker of the House, Jewish Senate Majority Leader, 6 Catholics and 2 Jews in the Supreme Court, a mixed race female vice president, and so on, they would have thought that's unbelievable. It couldn't possibly be. Maybe the Pope has taken over somehow, or the Jews are manipulating the Catholics, or who knows what. But it would have been, so when people said that people lack the imagination to be able to see that 60 years from now, we could have a sort of a post-racial society. When I say post-racial, I don't mean that people are not aware of their heritage, just like people celebrate St. Patrick's Day and, as if they're Irish Americans, but that your life circumstances are not dictated by your race. And I think at the grassroots in the United States, if you walk around anywhere in the United States, you see every possible mixture of couple. And I'm only to an extent I wasn't really aware of, because it's just in the background. When I wrote the book, I started becoming aware of it. It's like, and at the grassroots, people are mixing, and they don't, 98% of Americans under 30 approve of interracial marriage. The statistic in 1958 was 4%, single digit.
Wow.
So this is a huge change. So
huge change.
At the grassroots, people are increasingly finding race and background to be irrelevant, but we have in the establishment, the
good old boys,
universities, the bureaucrats, the big corporations who are sort of wedded to the system of classification. They don't want to let it go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting. So it's been a lot of fun talking to you, David. Thank you so much for coming on the show and chatting with me about all this stuff. Very enlightening, and congratulations on your book. That's really cool stuff. Very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Al. I appreciate it.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.